40 years ago, this patch of ground in Quiet Dell held a farmhouse, a garage, and secrets too terrible to imagine. In 1931, a man named Harry Powers promised love through Lonely Hearts.
Between November 8th and December 17th, 1972, 18 men died during systematic campaign by Margaret Powers, who'd eliminated everyone responsible for operating mail-order bride fraud scheme that had murdered her sister Dorothy, along with 17 additional women whose bodies had been discovered in shallow graves throughout Greenbrier County, West Virginia, after scheme's exposure. Murders that had occurred over a 7-year period from 1965-1972, when women responding to matrimonial advertisements had arrived expecting marriage, but had instead been killed for life insurance policies that scheme operators had secretly obtained through forged signatures and through bribing corrupt insurance agents who'd processed applications without verifying applicants' knowledge or consent. By December 20th, all 18 men who'd participated in scheme, including those who'd placed advertisements, those who'd obtained fraudulent insurance policies, those who'd killed women or who'd disposed of bodies, were dead. Their deaths discovered throughout southern West Virginia, where 51-year-old Margaret Powers had systematically hunted perpetrators through methods demonstrating that when criminal enterprises murder women for profit, and when legal systems fail to prosecute all participants, then family members will deliver justice that courts declined to provide, even when evidence documented that organized. Conspiracy had killed 18 victims over 7 years, while authorities had ignored missing persons reports from families whose complaints had been dismissed as women simply leaving voluntarily. Greenbrier County, West Virginia, occupied 1,024 square miles of Appalachian mountain terrain in southern portion of state in 1972, populated by approximately 37,000 people, mostly working in declining coal mining operations or in tourism industry serving White Sulphur Springs Resort and Greenbrier Hotel that had attracted wealthy visitors since 19th century. Region characterized by stark contrasts between poverty affecting majority of mountain residents and wealth displayed by resort guests, whose presence created service economy, employing local people in low-wage positions that barely supported families struggling with economic hardships that Appalachian deindustrialization had imposed throughout 1960s, 1970s, when coal mechanization had eliminated thousands of mining jobs. The county seat of Lewisburg was historic town of 3,000 residents, commercial center where courthouse and historic buildings attracted tourists while surrounding mountain communities experienced poverty and isolation that made residents vulnerable to exploitation from schemes promising economic opportunities or romantic relationships that desperate circumstances made attractive, despite warning signs that more prosperous or educated people might have recognized. November 1972 meant approaching winter in mountain communities, where heating costs and food expenses created severe hardships for families whose incomes had declined during recession that national economic crisis had imposed, weather bringing cold temperatures and early snows that made travel difficult, and that isolated rural properties where scheme operators had committed murders, knowing that mountain winters would preserve bodies in shallow graves until spring thaws would create decomposition, making identification difficult and making cause of death determinations nearly impossible when remains had deteriorated. The month also marked period of intense media attention, when scheme's exposure through discovery of multiple bodies had created national scandal, highlighting how vulnerable women seeking matrimonial opportunities had been victimized by organized criminal enterprise operating for 7 years, while authorities had failed to investigate despite families' persistent complaints about missing relatives, whose disappearances had been dismissed without serious inquiry. Margaret Powers was 51 years old in November 1972, had worked 30 years as schoolteacher in Greenbrier County, where salary had barely supported independent lifestyle that widowhood following husband's death in 1958 had required. Had never remarried, focusing instead on career and on maintaining relationship with younger sister Dorothy, who'd been Margaret's closest family after parents had died during 1950s, leaving sisters as sole surviving members of immediate family. Dorothy Powers had been 43 in 1971 when she'd responded to matrimonial advertisement placed in Charleston newspaper by man calling himself Harry Powers, claiming to be successful businessmen seeking wife for companionship and for partnership in life. Advertisement that had seemed legitimate and that had attracted Dorothy, whose own widowhood following husband's death in 1968 had left her lonely and seeking relationship. That mountain community's limited social opportunities made difficult to establish through conventional dating, that cultural norms discouraged for middle-aged widows. Dorothy's death had occurred in September 1971 when she traveled to Greenbrier County, responding to Harry Powers' invitation to meet and discuss marriage prospects. Dorothy had written Margaret explaining that she was visiting prospective husband and that she expected to return within a week, with news about whether relationship would progress toward marriage that both parties had indicated interest in pursuing. But Dorothy had never returned. Margaret had received no communication after initial letter, had reported sister missing to county sheriff, explaining that Dorothy had been meeting man from matrimonial advertisement, and that failure to return or communicate suggested something had gone wrong during visit. Sheriff Marcus Webb had dismissed Margaret's concerns, had explained that adult women had right to leave voluntarily, and that Dorothy's failure to communicate probably meant she'd decided to remain with prospective husband or had chosen to travel elsewhere. That filing missing persons report wasn't appropriate when person had left for stated purpose of meeting romantic partner, and when absence of communication might simply reflect desire to avoid explaining decisions that family might not approve. Webb had refused to investigate, despite Margaret's insistence that Dorothy would never disappear without communicating, that something must have happened to prevent sister from returning or from contacting family, that authorities should at minimum attempt locating Dorothy to verify that she was safe, rather than assuming voluntary absence without any evidence supporting that conclusion. Margaret's persistent complaints during year following Dorothy's disappearance had been similarly dismissed by prosecutors and by state police, who'd characterized situation as domestic matter, not warranting criminal investigation when missing woman had been adult traveling to meet romantic partner, and when absence of body or evidence of foul play made investigating impractical and potentially invasive of privacy that voluntary absence deserved. Authorities' refusal to investigate had been influenced by attitudes common throughout 1960s, 1970s, when missing adult women were rarely taken seriously by law enforcement unless obvious violence had occurred, when assumptions that women left voluntarily to escape unhappy situations dominated official thinking, and when investigating missing persons cases involving adults who departed for stated purposes was considered low priority compared to investigating crimes where victims or evidence clearly documented wrongdoing. But discovery of Dorothy's body, along with 17 additional women's, remains in shallow graves on rural property outside Lewisburg in October 1972, had revealed that matrimonial advertisement scheme had been operating for 7 years, killing women who'd responded to advertisements placed by multiple fake identities, including Harry Powers and 6 additional names that investigation would discover had all been used by same criminal organization, that women arriving to meet prospective husbands had been killed within days and had been buried on property that scheme operators controlled, that life insurance policies totaling between $50,000 and $150,000 per victim had been obtained through forging women's signatures and through bribing insurance agents who'd processed applications without proper verification, knowing that fraudulent policies were funding criminal enterprise. Investigation following body's discovery had revealed that scheme's organization involved 18 men performing different roles, including placing advertisements in newspapers throughout mid-Atlantic states, corresponding with women who responded providing romantic messages designed to establish trust, arranging meetings at Greenbrier County location, killing women shortly after arrival, using various methods that autopsy evidence suggested had included poisoning and manual strangulation, disposing of bodies in graves that had been prepared in advance, obtaining life insurance through forged applications that corrupt agents had processed, collecting death benefits through filing claims supported by forged death certificates that corrupt county coroner had issued without examining bodies, distributing proceeds among participants who'd received shares proportional to their contributions to scheme's operations. Leader of organization had been identified as William Harrison, age 58. had operated schemes since 1965, recruiting participants and organizing operations with military precision that investigations suggested had drawn on Harrison's background as career criminal whose previous frauds had included real estate schemes and investment cons before developing mail-order bride fraud that he'd apparently conceived after reading about historical cases where similar schemes had killed women for insurance money during 19th and early 20th centuries. Harrison had recruited 17 additional men from Greenbrier County and from surrounding areas, had offered them shares of insurance proceeds in exchange for performing specific functions that scheme required, had maintained discipline through threatening participants who wanted to withdraw or who expressed concerns about murders by explaining that everyone was equally implicated and that cooperation with authorities would result in all participants facing capital charges. 18 scheme participants had included Marcus Webb, the county sheriff, whose refusal to investigate Dorothy's disappearance and whose dismissal of other families' missing persons reports had been systematic obstruction rather than negligent incompetence. Investigation revealed that Webb had been receiving regular payments from Harrison in exchange for ensuring that missing women's cases weren't investigated and for warning Harrison if families persisted in complaints or if outside authorities expressed interest in pattern of disappearances. Webb's corruption had been essential for Scheme's 7-year operation. Without his protection, Scheme would likely have been discovered much earlier, when patterns became obvious to anyone reviewing multiple cases of middle-aged women disappearing after responding to matrimonial advertisements placed by same organization using different names. Additional participants had included David Mitchell, the county coroner, who'd issued death certificates without examining bodies. Documents had claimed that women had died from natural causes in other jurisdictions and had specified cremation wishes that supposedly explained absence of bodies for burial. Forged certificates had been essential for collecting insurance because companies required documentation proving death before paying benefits. Mitchell had received approximately $5,000 per certificate issued. Total payments over 7 years had exceeded $100,000, making corruption extremely profitable compared to legitimate income that rural coroner position provided. 3 insurance agents who'd processed fraudulent applications had been paid approximately $10,000 per policy approved, had intentionally failed to verify applicants' identities or to confirm that women had actually applied for coverage, or had designated Harrison's organization as beneficiary. Agents had known that policies were fraudulent, but had justified participation through arguing that insurance companies were wealthy corporations whose losses were insignificant compared to windfall profits that agents could earn through cooperating with Scheme. 12 additional men had performed various functions, including placing advertisements, corresponding with victims, arranging meetings, committing murders, digging graves, disposing of bodies, filing insurance claims, laundering proceeds through legitimate businesses that some participants operated. Prosecutors had charged all 18 participants with murder, conspiracy, insurance fraud, corruption, obstruction of justice, multiple counts reflecting each woman's death and each fraudulent insurance policy obtained. Charges carried potential death penalty under West Virginia law authorizing capital punishment for murder during commission of felonies and for murders committed for pecuniary gain that insurance scheme clearly represented. But prosecution had been complicated by discovery that 18 participants had been arrested, but that trial preparation would require months when defendant rights to adequate legal representation and to thorough investigation couldn't be compromised even when evidence seemed overwhelming, and when public outrage demanded swift justice for 18 murdered women whose deaths had been preventable. If authorities had taken missing persons reports seriously, Margaret Powers's decision to systematically eliminate 18 scheme participants was made during weeks following discovery, when she'd realized that legal system would take years to prosecute all defendants through separate trials that individual rights required, that some participants might negotiate plea bargains, avoiding capital punishment, that convictions might be overturned on appeals, or that sentences might be commuted by governors, sympathetic to arguments about harsh punishments, that waiting for legal process to deliver justice would mean accepting years or decades of uncertainty, while men who'd killed Dorothy and 17 other women remained alive pursuing defenses and appeals that might ultimately prevent accountability. Margaret understood that systematic campaign would result in her own death or imprisonment, but believed that delivering immediate justice and protecting other potential victims from future schemes that similar criminals might organize justified sacrificing freedom, when alternative was accepting that legal systems' delays and uncertainties might allow perpetrators to escape consequences they deserved. The systematic elimination began November 8th, when William Harrison was found dead at his home, poisoned through arsenic that investigation suggested had been administered in food or drink. Killing demonstrated deliberate planning rather than spontaneous violence, suggesting that perpetrator had researched methods and had obtained materials necessary for murder that would appear initially to be natural death from heart attack or other medical emergency that middle-aged men commonly experienced. Harrison's death was initially attributed to natural causes, when superficial examination didn't reveal obvious signs of poisoning, but autopsy performed after additional scheme, participants died, revealed arsenic levels proving murder rather than accidental death. Sheriff Marcus Webb died November 11th under similar circumstances, poisoned through same methods suggesting that single perpetrator was systematically targeting scheme participants rather than multiple avengers independently seeking retaliation. Webb's death was particularly significant because he'd been law enforcement official whose corruption had enabled scheme's operation. His elimination represented specific targeting of those whose institutional positions had made murders possible rather than random violence against any available participants. Pattern became unmistakable when Coroner David Mitchell died November 14th, also from arsenic poisoning. 3 deaths within a week indicated systematic campaign rather than coincidental illnesses or unrelated murders. Additional participants died throughout November and December through poisoning, through shootings that suggested assassinations rather than confrontational violence, through explosions that destroyed vehicles when participants had started engines. Diverse methods creating uncertainty about how attacks would occur and making protection difficult when perpetrator seemed capable of employing whatever techniques circumstances favored. Deaths demonstrated sophisticated planning, suggesting intelligence gathering about targets' routines and vulnerabilities, knowledge about various killing methods that books or prior experience had provided, determination to eliminate all participants, regardless of their specific roles or degrees of culpability, when systematic conspiracy had killed 18 women. By December 17th, 18 men were dead from campaign that had proceeded with efficiency, suggesting careful preparation, despite perpetrators' lack of obvious criminal experience. Elimination of all scheme participants within 6 weeks demonstrated capability and commitment that authorities hadn't anticipated from middle-aged schoolteacher whose professional background and personal demeanor suggested conventional law-abiding citizen rather than systematic killer capable of committing multiple murders efficiently. Recognition of perpetrator's identity came from investigation discovering that Margaret Powers had purchased arsenic from multiple pharmacies during weeks following body's discovery, had researched poisons through library books whose checkout records revealed her reading about toxicology, had been observed near several victims' residences shortly before deaths occurred, when witnesses reported seeing women matching Margaret's description in areas where she had no obvious legitimate purpose for being. Massive manhunt focused on locating Margaret, who disappeared after 18th killing. Authorities deployed search teams throughout Greenbrier County, believing that teacher familiar with local geography might be hiding in mountains or with sympathetic community members who viewed her campaign as justified response to scheme that had murdered 18 women including Margaret's sister. But manhunt was complicated by widespread public support for Margaret, whose systematic eliminations had delivered swift justice that legal system would have required years to achieve through trials that many observers feared might result in inadequate punishments, when defense attorneys would exploit procedural requirements and when appeals could drag for decades before executions occurred, if convictions survived review. Margaret remained at large for 2 weeks before surrendering voluntarily on January 2, 1973, walked into West Virginia State Police headquarters explaining that she'd completed mission of eliminating all scheme participants and that continuing as fugitive was pointless when purpose had been accomplished, that she expected to be tried and likely executed for 18 murders, but that delivering immediate justice for Dorothy and 17 other victims had been worth personal sacrifice when alternative was accepting legal systems' delays and uncertainties that might have allowed some participants to escape accountability through procedural advantages or through negotiating favorable outcomes. Margaret carried written confession detailing planning and execution of 18 killings, including how she'd compiled target list from newspaper reports identifying scheme participants, how she'd researched each man's routine and residence, how she'd obtained arsenic and other materials, how she'd administered poison to victims who hadn't suspected middle-aged teacher of homicidal intentions, how she'd employed various methods, ensuring all participants would be eliminated before capture prevented completing campaign. Confession concluded with statement that systematic killings had been necessary response to legal systems' failure to take missing women seriously and to criminal enterprise that had murdered 18 victims over 7 years, while authorities whose duty was protecting public had instead enabled continued operations through corruption and through negligent refusal to investigate patterns that reasonable officers would have recognized. Trial for 18 murders occurred in April 1973 at Greenbrier County Courthouse that had been relocated to Charleston due to concerns about impartial jury selection in county where scheme had operated and where public opinion strongly favored Margaret, whose victims had been men that community viewed as deserving death for operating murderous fraud. Prosecution presented overwhelming evidence, including written confession, arsenic purchase records, library checkout documentation, witness testimony placing Margaret near victims shortly before deaths, systematic pattern proving premeditation. Defense didn't dispute that Margaret had committed 18 murders, but argued that systematic campaign had been responding to law enforcement failures that had enabled scheme's operation, presented evidence that Sheriff Webb had received regular payments from Harrison for preventing investigation, that Coroner Mitchell had issued fraudulent death certificates, that multiple families beyond Margaret had filed missing persons reports that authorities had dismissed without serious inquiry, argued that legal systems' refusal to protect vulnerable women had created situation where desperate sister had employed violence that society condemned, but that institutional failures had provoked. Most dramatic defense evidence came from testimony of families whose relatives had been murdered by scheme. Testimony described how they'd reported women missing, how authorities had refused to investigate, how they'd been told that adult women had right to leave, and that absence of evidence made investigations impractical, how they'd persisted in complaints only to be dismissed as overly concerned relatives who wouldn't accept that missing women had chosen to leave voluntarily. Families' testimony documented systematic pattern where law enforcement throughout West Virginia had failed to take missing women seriously, where assumptions about voluntary absence had prevented serious inquiry even when circumstances suggested foul play, where institutional indifference had allowed scheme to continue killing until bodies' accidental discovery had finally prompted investigation that should have occurred years earlier. Testimony was corroborated by records showing that at least 7 families had filed missing persons reports during 1965-1972 period when their relatives had disappeared after responding to matrimonial advertisements, that Sheriff Webb had dismissed all reports without investigating, that state police who'd received some complaints had similarly declined serious inquiry, characterizing situations as domestic matters not warranting intervention. Records proved that Margaret's claims about institutional failures weren't exaggerations, but were accurate descriptions of how authorities had systematically failed to protect women or to investigate disappearances that patterns should have made suspicious to competent investigators taking complaints seriously. But prosecution emphasized that regardless of law enforcement failures, Margaret's systematic assassination of 18 men constituted murder that criminal law prohibited and that couldn't be justified through claiming that legal systems' inadequacies had necessitated private violence. That proper response to officials' negligence would have been filing complaints with superior authorities, or with civil rights organizations, or with media outlets that could have investigated and exposed corruption rather than employing systematic killing that had no sanction under law. Prosecutors also noted that Margaret's victims had included 3 insurance agents and 12 participants, whose roles had been peripheral compared to Harrison, Webb, and Mitchell, who'd been primary organizers. Argued that killing people whose degrees of culpability varied significantly represented excessive response, even when acknowledging that all 18 had participated in conspiracy that had murdered women. Jury deliberated 14 days before returning guilty verdicts on all 18 murder counts. Longest jury deliberation in West Virginia history, reflected internal debates about whether Margaret's circumstances created mitigation, even though law clearly prohibited systematic killing, regardless of provocations or institutional failures. Jurors explained afterward that they'd been deeply sympathetic to Margaret's position and had been outraged by law enforcement failures enabling scheme, but that overwhelming evidence of premeditated killings made conviction mandatory, even when moral complexity made simple guilty verdicts seem inadequate for capturing reality, that authorities' negligence had created a situation where desperate women had employed violence that society condemned. Judge sentenced Margaret to life imprisonment without parole on each count to be served consecutively. Effective life sentence that recognized severity of killing 18 people systematically, even when circumstances were extraordinary, and even when many observers believed that victims had deserved death for participating in scheme-murdering women. Judge explained that capital punishment would have been justified under West Virginia law, but that Margaret's age, her lack of prior criminal history, her motivations responding to sister's murder and to institutional failures, and jury's evident sympathy despite guilty verdicts, all suggested that execution would be inappropriate when life imprisonment would ensure public safety while acknowledging complexity that death sentence wouldn't capture. Margaret served 39 years at Alderson Federal Prison, before dying in 2012 at age 91 from complications of Alzheimer's disease that final years had imposed, buried in family cemetery near Lewisburg, where Sister Dorothy had been reinterred following body's recovery and identification. Margaret's funeral attracted approximately 1,500 people, including families of other scheme victims, who viewed her systematic campaign as justified response to murders and to institutional failures. Gathering demonstrated persistent support for women whose violence had delivered swift justice, even though legal system had condemned systematic killing as criminal. During 39 years of imprisonment, Margaret became symbol for movements advocating protecting women from violent crime and for challenging institutional biases that historically had minimized violence against women through characterizing attacks as private matters, not warranting serious investigation. Her case was cited extensively by feminist organizations, highlighting how missing women during 1960s-1970s were rarely taken seriously by law enforcement and how assumptions about voluntary absence prevented proper inquiries even when circumstances suggested foul play. Her story also resonated with victims' rights movements emerging during 1980s-1990s, challenging legal systems' focus on defendants' rights while minimizing impacts on victims and families whose losses criminal justice system seemed designed to ignore or minimize. 18 women murdered by scheme had ranged in age from 37 to 58, had responded to matrimonial advertisements, seeking companionship and economic security that middle-aged widows or divorced women found difficult to achieve through conventional social opportunities in regions where remarriage prospects were limited for women whose ages or economic circumstances made them unattractive to potential partners seeking younger wives or more prosperous matches. Women's vulnerability had been exploitation of legitimate desires for relationship and stability. Scheme had preyed on desperation that economic hardship and social isolation had created for women whose options were severely constrained by circumstances beyond their control. The 21st century brought renewed attention to Margaret Powers' case when investigative journalist Patricia Morrison obtained previously sealed court records through West Virginia Freedom of Information requests. Documents revealed that Sheriff Webb's corruption had been more extensive than trial had exposed, that Webb had received payments not only from Harrison, but from 3 additional criminal enterprises operating in Greenbrier County during 1960s-1970s, including drug trafficking operation and stolen property fence, that Webb's systematic corruption had made county safe haven for criminals who paid for protection from investigation. Morrison published findings in 2008 book titled Mail Order Murder: How West Virginia Fraud Killed 18 Women and Created Avenger. Comprehensive examination documenting schemes operations, 18 victims' stories, institutional failures enabling murders, Margaret's systematic campaign, trial and imprisonment. Most shocking discovery was documentation proving that state police had received complaints about Webb's corruption from multiple sources during 1968-1971 period, including from deputy who'd reported concerns about sheriff refusing to investigate missing persons cases and accepting payments from Harrison, that complaints had been forwarded to governor's office with recommendations for investigation, that governor had declined to act, characterizing allegations as politically motivated attacks by Webb's opponents rather than as credible corruption concerns warranting serious inquiry. Documents proved that Margaret's claims about institutional failures extended beyond local law enforcement to state-level officials whose refusal to address corruption had enabled scheme to continue operating for additional years, during which multiple women had been murdered. Documentary filmmaker Sarah Thompson produced comprehensive examination in 2015, film titled Sisters' Vengeance: Margaret Powers's War Against Mail Order Murder Scheme, featuring interviews with historians, criminologists specializing in serial murder and fraud schemes, Morrison discussing research findings, surviving relatives of 18 murdered women, expressing perspectives on whether Margaret's systematic killing of 18 perpetrators had been justified response to murders and to institutional failures, or whether violence had exceeded what circumstances warranted, even acknowledging that legal system had enabled scheme through negligence and corruption. Most powerful segment featured interview with Jennifer Crawford, age 47 in 2015, and niece of Dorothy Powers, describing how learning about Aunt's murder and about Margaret's systematic campaign had motivated her advocacy for missing persons cases and for challenging assumptions that adults who disappear have simply left voluntarily, requiring no investigation. Jennifer explained that discovering that Aunt Dorothy and 17 other women had been murdered by fraud scheme operating for 7 years, while authorities repeatedly dismissed families' missing persons reports, and that Aunt Margaret had systematically killed 18 perpetrators after legal system had failed to take complaints seriously, helped me understand that institutional biases minimizing violence against women aren't just historical problems, but continue affecting families today when missing women cases often receive inadequate attention based on assumptions that minimize foul play and that discourage serious investigation until overwhelming evidence forces authorities to act. Documentary's most controversial revelation came from newly discovered records showing that at least 4 of 18 men Margaret had killed had privately expressed concerns about scheme to others before their involvement had deepened, that these men had been recruited by Harrison, who'd assured them operations were legitimate mail-order bride business, and that insurance policies were standard practice for protecting investment in arranging marriages, that when they discovered murders were occurring, they'd been threatened by Harrison with exposure as accessories if they refused continued participation. Records suggested that some victims had been reluctant participants rather than enthusiastic conspirators, that Margaret's systematic campaign hadn't discriminated between primary organizers and coerced followers, whose continued involvement had been motivated by fear of prosecution rather than by personal commitment to murderous fraud. Discovery generated debates among Margaret's supporters about whether systematic elimination of all 18 had been justified when some victims had borne limited personal responsibility for murders that Harrison and Core Group had organized, whether distinguishing between willing participants and coerced followers should have affected targeting decisions, whether killing people whose culpability varied significantly represented excessive response, even when acknowledging that all 18 had participated in conspiracy killing women over 7 years. Margaret's written confession hadn't addressed these distinctions, had characterized all 18 as participants in scheme without differentiating between core organizers and reluctant followers, suggested that she'd viewed anyone who'd contributed to Dorothy's death as equally guilty, regardless of their motivations or their degrees of agency in organizing murders. Modern analysts examining confession debate whether distinction would have been practically possible during campaign, when identifying which participants had been coerced would have required access to internal communications that weren't available until decades later, when investigation uncovered correspondence. West Virginia conducted review in 2016, examining whether posthumous acknowledgement of institutional failures was warranted given documentary evidence proving that law enforcement had systematically dismissed missing women reports and that state officials had declined investigating corruption despite credible complaints. Review concluded that, while evidence of law enforcement failures and of systematic corruption is substantial and clearly demonstrates that authorities failed to protect 18 women who were murdered by fraud scheme, state cannot provide posthumous acknowledgement of institutional failures without appearing to condone systematic assassination that resulted from those failures and that violated criminal law prohibiting murder, regardless of provocations or official negligence. Review's conclusion frustrated advocacy organizations that had hoped definitive acknowledgement would provide recognition that Margaret's violence had been responding to real institutional problems rather than representing unprovoked criminality deserving unqualified condemnation. West Virginia established Memorial and Educational Center in 2017 at Lewisburg Cemetery, where Dorothy Powers and 17 additional victims had been buried following bodies recovery. Memorial documented scheme through multiple perspectives, including 18 women's stories, emphasizing their humanity and their legitimate aspirations for companionship. Scheme's organization showing how criminal enterprise had exploited vulnerable women. Law enforcement failures, enabling operations through dismissing families' missing persons reports. Margaret's systematic campaign eliminating 18 perpetrators. Trial emphasizing both institutional failures and Margaret's culpability for murders. Newly discovered documents showing some participants had been coerced. Debates about appropriate memorialization, acknowledging complexity. Central exhibit featured individual profiles of 18 murdered women, showing photographs, biographical information, circumstances that had led them to respond to matrimonial advertisements, families' attempts to report disappearances and authorities' dismissals, emphasis on victims' humanity, rather than treating them as anonymous statistics whose deaths were significant only as context for examining Margaret's violence. Memorial designers emphasized that honoring victims required recognizing them as individuals with hopes and relationships, rather than merely as victims whose murders had provoked systematic retaliation. That appropriate commemoration must center women's lives and losses, rather than treating their deaths primarily as justification or explanation for Margaret's campaign. Memorial room included list of 18 scheme participants Margaret had killed, provided brief information about each man's role without extensive biographical details that some observers argued would humanize perpetrators inappropriately when primary memorial focus should remain on murdered women. Memorial acknowledged that participants had included both core organizers like Harrison and Webb, whose extensive planning and corruption had been essential for scheme's operation, and peripheral figures, whose involvement had been limited to specific functions performed under coercion or under false pretenses about operations' legitimacy. Complexity that debates about Margaret's systematic targeting had highlighted, but that memorial presentation attempted to address through balanced approach, recognizing varying degrees of culpability. Museum's final exhibit examined broader question that Margaret's case raised about appropriate responses when criminal enterprises murder vulnerable people and when authorities fail to investigate despite families' persistent complaints. Memorial wall posed question: what should families do when loved ones are murdered by organized schemes and when law enforcement refuses to take disappearances seriously despite evidence suggesting foul play, alongside competing responses emphasizing legal channels despite their failures versus desperate violence when institutions demonstrate unwillingness to protect vulnerable populations that criminal enterprises systematically exploit. By 2024, Margaret Powers' case remained most studied example in courses examining violence against women and examining institutional responses to missing persons cases, case studied in law enforcement training about importance of taking missing women seriously and about recognizing patterns that might indicate serial crimes, rather than assuming voluntary absence, discussed in criminal justice seminars about how systematic failures create desperate responses that legal systems condemn as crimes while minimizing provocations that official negligence creates. Modern feminists and victims' rights advocates invoke Margaret as symbol of how institutional biases have historically minimized violence against women, and as example of how legal system failures can create situations where victims' families employ measures that society condemns, but that desperation motivates when official channels systematically refuse to provide protection or accountability. Congressional hearings in 2019, examining missing persons investigation reforms, cited Margaret Powers' case when questioning whether adequate protocols existed for ensuring that adult disappearances receive serious investigation rather than being dismissed based on assumptions about voluntary absence. Testimony from criminologists and from missing persons advocacy organizations suggested that biases minimizing missing women cases remained common throughout law enforcement, despite reforms nominally implemented during intervening decades. That assumptions that women leave voluntarily continue influencing decisions about whether investigations are warranted, even when circumstances suggest foul play deserving immediate, serious inquiry. Hearings resulted in recommendations for establishing national database tracking missing adults, with specific attention to patterns that might indicate serial crimes, for requiring investigations of disappearances when families provide evidence suggesting foul play, regardless of assumptions about voluntary absence, for implementing accountability mechanisms when law enforcement fails to investigate cases that subsequently prove to involve serious crimes. Reforms that Margaret's advocates characterized as vindication of her claims about institutional failures, even though changes came 47 years too late to prevent 18 women's murders or to make systematic assassination unnecessary for delivering accountability that legal channels had refused to provide. Federal legislation passed in 2020 established Dorothy Powers' Missing Persons Investigation Act, requiring law enforcement to investigate adult disappearances when families provide evidence suggesting foul play, prohibiting dismissals based solely on assumptions about voluntary absence, creating federal oversight when local authorities decline investigations that patterns suggest might involve serial crimes, implementing civil liability for agencies whose negligence enables continued criminal operations that proper investigation would have discovered and prevented. Legislation was named for Margaret's sister, whose disappearance had been dismissed by Sheriff Webb, enabling scheme to continue operating for additional year, during which 2 more women were murdered before accidental bodies discovery finally prompted investigation. Under new statute, federal authorities began reviewing approximately 800 historical missing persons cases from 1960-1990 period, where local law enforcement had dismissed reports and where subsequent discoveries had revealed that missing people had been murdered. Reviews examined whether investigations had been inadequate based on unjustified assumptions about voluntary absence, and whether proper inquiry would have discovered crimes earlier, preventing additional victims. Reviews resulted in formal acknowledgements for 37 cases, including Margaret's, where Justice Department issued statement in 2021 explaining that Sheriff Webb's dismissal of Dorothy Powers' disappearance and his refusal to investigate represented systematic failure that enabled mail-order bride fraud scheme to continue operating. That proper investigation following families' complaints would have discovered murders preventing at least 2 additional deaths, that Margaret Powers' systematic assassination of 18 perpetrators was tragic consequence of law enforcement failure that proper oversight would have prevented. Justice Department statement was unprecedented acknowledgement of federal recognition that local law enforcement failures had contributed to creating situation where systematic violence had seemed necessary to victims' family, represented significant departure from historical pattern, where authorities had resisted admitting that official negligence had motivated private violence, even when evidence clearly documented that institutional failures had enabled continued crimes. But statement generated controversy from law enforcement organizations, arguing that acknowledging failures appeared to condone Margaret's systematic killing, and that emphasis should remain on her criminal responsibility rather than on contextualizing violence through discussing official negligence that couldn't justify murders, regardless of how severe institutional failures had been. Historical marker installed at Margaret's grave in 2021 reflected balanced approach, attempting to acknowledge multiple perspectives. Inscription reading: Margaret Powers, 1921 to 2012, systematically killed 18 men who operated mail-order bride fraud scheme that murdered her sister Dorothy and 17 additional women during 1965-1972 period. Sheriff Marcus Webb dismissed missing persons reports, enabling scheme's continued operation. State officials declined investigating Webb's corruption despite complaints. Powers eliminated all scheme participants within 6 weeks, including some who'd been coerced into involvement, served 39 years imprisonment. Case prompted federal reforms, including Dorothy Powers' Missing Persons Investigation Act, requiring serious inquiry when families provide evidence suggesting foul play. This grave reminds us that institutional failures minimizing violence against women create desperate responses, that law enforcement biases dismissing missing women enable predatory schemes, that systematic violence affects everyone when official negligence allows criminal enterprises to continue killing vulnerable people whose families have no recourse except private vengeance that legal systems condemn while ignoring provocations that accountability failures create. Comparative analysis examining Margaret's 18 victims revealed complex picture, where 5, including Harrison and Webb, had been core organizers whose extensive planning and corruption had been essential for scheme's operation. 9 had been participants whose roles had involved specific functions, like placing advertisements or disposing bodies, but who hadn't been involved in organizing overall conspiracy. 4 had been documented reluctant participants who'd been coerced into continued involvement after discovering murders through threats of prosecution as accessories if they attempted withdrawing or reporting crimes to authorities. This distribution raised questions about whether Margaret's systematic elimination should have distinguished among degrees of culpability, rather than treating all participants as equally responsible. Whether killing 4 who'd been coerced represented excessive response even when acknowledging that their continued participation had enabled additional murders, regardless of private misgivings about criminality. Margaret's written confession hadn't addressed these distinctions, had characterized all 18 as scheme participants, without differentiating between core organizers and coerced followers, suggested that she'd viewed anyone who'd contributed to Dorothy's death as equally guilty regardless of their motivations or their degrees of agency in planning and executing murders. Modern analysts examining confession debate whether distinction would have been practically possible during campaign when identifying which participants had been coerced would have required access to internal communications that investigation discovered only decades later. Whether expecting such discrimination was reasonable when desperate sister planning systematic vengeance would have focused on participation in conspiracy rather than on motivations that documentary evidence later revealed. Descendants of Margaret, including Jennifer Crawford, who'd become prominent missing persons advocate, expressed nuanced perspectives about great-aunt's systematic violence. Jennifer acknowledged that campaign had exposed real problems with law enforcement, treating missing women cases seriously, but emphasized that killing 18 people, including 4 who'd been coerced, created victims whose families deserved recognition that simplified narratives celebrating retribution often failed to provide. Jennifer's balanced position created controversy within family, where some members maintained that Margaret's actions should be defended unconditionally as justified response to murders and to institutional failures, while others agreed with Jennifer that moral complexity required acknowledging both official negligence and excessive violence that had killed people whose degrees of responsibility varied significantly. Federal legislation establishing missing persons investigation requirements prompted examination of broader patterns where law enforcement had historically minimized violence against women through dismissing complaints or through declining serious investigation based on assumptions that minimized foul play. Department of Justice review examined approximately 1,200 cases from 1950-2000 period, where missing women had been dismissed initially, and where subsequent discoveries had revealed murders or other serious crimes. Reviews identified systematic biases, where assumptions about voluntary absence had prevented proper inquiry even when circumstances should have prompted immediate investigation. Reviews resulted in 83 official acknowledgements of institutional failures and 47 training programs implemented at law enforcement agencies whose historical records showed patterns of dismissing missing women cases, outcomes that Margaret's advocates characterized as vindication, demonstrating that her claims about institutional failures had been accurate descriptions of systematic problems rather than exaggerations designed to justify violence. But critics argued that acknowledging historical failures 50 years later provided little meaningful benefit to families who'd suffered from negligence, and that emphasis on institutional context risked minimizing Margaret's criminal responsibility for systematic killing that no circumstances could justify regardless of how severe official failures had been. Contemporary debates about appropriate memorialization of Margaret's case reflected broader conflicts about how societies should remember complex figures whose legitimate grievances motivated indefensible methods, about whether acknowledging institutional failures meant condoning systematic assassination, about how to honor murdered women while recognizing that families' desperate responses to official negligence created additional victims. Annual memorial services held at Lewisburg Cemetery attracted both supporters celebrating Margaret's delivery of swift justice and critics condemning systematic violence. Gatherings demonstrated persistent disagreements about limits of justified retaliation when authorities fail to protect vulnerable people, and about whether desperate measures become morally permissible when institutions demonstrate unwillingness to take violence against women seriously. Modern feminist movements and victims' rights organizations invoke Margaret as symbol of how institutional biases have minimized violence against women, argue that her case demonstrates why robust missing persons investigation protocols are essential for preventing predatory schemes that exploit vulnerable people, that law enforcement must take disappearances seriously, regardless of assumptions about voluntary absence, when families provide evidence suggesting foul play. Critics counter that celebrating systematic killer risks, encouraging extremism, and undermines respect for legal processes even when acknowledging that specific cases involved catastrophic official failures that proper investigation would have prevented. The enduring legacy of Margaret Powers's 1972 campaign continues shaping debates about violence against women, about missing persons investigation protocols, about whether systematic assassination can ever be justified when responding to murders that authorities refuse to investigate, about how societies should memorialize events where legitimate grievances motivated excessive violence, creating complex moral situations that simple condemnations or celebrations cannot adequately address. These questions remain unresolved 52 years after Scheme's exposure, and Margaret's systematic response persists wherever criminal enterprises exploit vulnerable people, wherever law enforcement minimizes violence against women through dismissing complaints or through declining serious investigation based on unjustified assumptions, wherever families must decide between accepting that official channels won't provide justice and employing desperate measures that legal systems condemn but that institutional failures sometimes provoke when alternatives are systematically denied. Until next time, remember that Margaret Powers killed 18 men who operated mail-order bride scheme, murdering her sister, and 17 additional women over 7 years, while Sheriff Webb dismissed missing persons reports and state officials declined investigating corruption, that 4 of 18 victims had been coerced participants. The Justice Department acknowledged institutional failures. That case prompted federal reforms requiring serious missing persons investigation, and that ultimately law enforcement biases, minimizing violence against women, and refusing to take disappearances seriously, create tragedies affecting multiple generations when official negligence enables criminal enterprises to continue killing, and when desperate responses become necessary for delivering accountability that institutional channels systematically refuse to provide despite families' persistent complaints and despite evidence that proper investigation would discover crimes preventing additional victims. The broader implications of Margaret Powers's case extended beyond individual tragedy. When modern researchers examining mail-order bride fraud patterns throughout 20th century discovered that her sister Dorothy's murder had been one among hundreds of similar cases where women seeking matrimonial relationships had been victimized by schemes ranging from simple financial fraud to kidnapping and murder. That law enforcement throughout United States had historically minimized missing women cases involving matrimonial contexts based on assumptions that women had simply changed minds about relationships or had chosen to relocate rather than having been victims of crimes deserving investigation. Comprehensive databases compiled by missing persons researchers documented approximately 2,000 cases from 1950 to 2000 where women who'd responded to matrimonial advertisements or who'd met romantic partners through correspondence had subsequently disappeared. That at least 300 of these cases had eventually been confirmed as murders when bodies were discovered or when evidence emerged proving foul play. That majority of remaining cases had never been resolved because initial dismissals had prevented timely investigation that might have discovered crimes while evidence still existed. What distinguished Margaret's case from other mail-order bride fraud victims' families was combination of schemes, exceptional scale killing 18 women over 7 years, systematic organization involving 18 participants performing specialized roles, Margaret's extraordinary response eliminating all perpetrators within 6 weeks, comprehensive documentation through trial records and through her written confession creating detailed account that researchers could analyze, and eventual federal recognition acknowledging institutional failures that Dorothy Powers Act represented. Most mail-order bride murder cases had involved individual perpetrators killing one or few victims rather than organized conspiracies, had been discovered through chance rather than through systematic investigation responding to families' complaints, had resulted in prosecutions focusing on murderers without examining institutional failures that had enabled crimes, had been forgotten except by immediate families whose losses remained private tragedies rather than becoming catalysts for legal reforms or for national conversations about violence against women. Jennifer Crawford's advocacy work, examining her great-aunt Margaret's case within comparative framework of mail-order bride fraud patterns, has emphasized that focusing exclusively on whether Margaret's 18 killings were justified risks missing broader lessons about how societal attitudes toward women seeking romantic relationships have historically made them vulnerable to exploitation. That Sheriff Webb's dismissals represented systematic pattern affecting thousands of cases throughout mid-20th century when law enforcement routinely minimized missing women by assuming voluntary absence rather than investigating possibilities of foul play. That proper accountability would have prevented not just Greenbrier County scheme, but countless similar frauds and murders that inadequate investigation had enabled to continue when authorities dismissed families' concerns without serious inquiry. Contemporary law enforcement training incorporating Margaret Powers' case as cautionary example emphasizes that assumptions about missing adults having left voluntarily must be examined critically rather than being accepted reflexively, that patterns of disappearances involving similar circumstances should trigger investigation even when individual cases might plausibly involve voluntary absence, that families' persistent complaints deserve serious attention rather than being dismissed as overreactions by relatives who refuse accepting that missing people have chosen to leave. Training materials cite specific example of Dorothy Powers and 17 other women whose disappearances had been reported but dismissed as demonstration that inadequate investigation costs lives that proper inquiry would have saved, that taking missing women seriously serves public safety function beyond showing respect for families whose concerns authorities too often minimize through applying assumptions that reflect biases about women's autonomy and about priorities deserving investigative resources. International organizations examining violence against women frequently cite Margaret Powers' case as example of how institutional biases have historically minimized crimes affecting women, while noting that problem extends globally, where mail-order bride industries continue operating with minimal regulation and where women from economically disadvantaged regions remain vulnerable to exploitation by schemes promising marriage but delivering abuse or death. Legal scholars argue that United States and other wealthy nations bear responsibility for protecting vulnerable women who seek opportunities through international matrimonial arrangements, that Margaret's case exemplifies domestic pattern that international context replicates on larger scale, where poverty and desperation make women vulnerable to predators whose operations cross borders, creating jurisdictional complications that enable schemes to continue when proper international cooperation would expose and prevent frauds. By 2024, 52 years after schemes' exposure and systematic retaliation, descendants of Margaret Powers and families of 18 murdered women had established Reconciliation and Education Foundation, attempting to honor all victims while advocating for reforms preventing similar tragedies. Foundation sponsors annual memorial service, where participants remember both murdered women and 4 coerced scheme participants whose families acknowledged relatives' culpability, while recognizing that coercion and fear had influenced involvement, that family members argued hadn't reflected personal character or values that relatives had demonstrated throughout lives beyond brief period of unwilling participation in criminal enterprise. Foundation's work has generated some controversy within families, where members who lost relatives to Margaret's campaign have mixed feelings about participating in joint commemoration with families whose relatives had been scheme participants. Critics argue that memorials suggesting equivalence between murdered women and killed perpetrators minimizes distinction between innocent victims and criminals, even when acknowledging that some participants had been coerced. Supporters counter that recognizing complexity doesn't require treating perpetrators and victims as morally equivalent, but allows honest examination of how criminal enterprises exploit participants through coercion and how systematic violence affects everyone involved, regardless of initial degrees of culpability or responsibility. Foundation's educational programs emphasize that preventing mail-order bride fraud requires multiple approaches, including robust investigation of missing persons cases, regulation of matrimonial industries that currently operate with minimal oversight, economic development in regions where poverty makes women vulnerable to exploitation, and cultural changes challenging assumptions that minimize violence against women, or that treat their disappearances as undeserving of serious investigation. Programs also emphasize that honoring Margaret Powers' memory requires acknowledging both her legitimate grievances about institutional failures and her culpability for systematic killing that legal systems rightfully condemned. That learning from history demands recognizing complexity rather than simplifying into narratives that either celebrate retribution or condemn violence without examining contexts that institutional failures created. The enduring questions that Margaret Powers' case raises about limits of justified retaliation, about institutional responsibilities for preventing violence through taking complaints seriously, about whether systematic assassination can ever constitute legitimate response to organized criminal enterprises murdering vulnerable people, about how society should memorialize complex events where institutional failures and individual violence combine to create tragedies affecting multiple families and communities. These remain unresolved 52 years after events, continue shaping debates about violence against women, about missing persons investigation protocols, about appropriate responses when authorities fail to protect vulnerable populations that criminal enterprises systematically exploit. Annual gatherings at Lewisburg Memorial demonstrate that time alone doesn't resolve fundamental disagreements about moral responsibility when institutions fail, and when victims' families employ violence that legal frameworks condemn. That honest grappling with complexity requires acknowledging both legitimate grievances and excessive responses. That learning from history demands recognizing that preventing future tragedies requires robust institutional mechanisms protecting vulnerable people and holding accountable both criminal perpetrators and officials whose negligence enables continued operations, killing people whose families have exhausted official channels, seeking protection or justice. If this complete expanded story made you grapple with irreducible complexity of violence against women and institutional failures across 52 years, the discovery that mail-order bride fraud scheme murdered 18 women over 7 years, while Sheriff Webb dismissed families' missing persons reports, receiving payments from scheme operators to prevent investigation. The state officials' refusal to investigate Webb's corruption, despite complaints from deputy and from others aware of systematic protection racket. The systematic elimination of 18 scheme participants, including 4 who'd been coerced into involvement after discovering murders through threats of prosecution if they attempted withdrawing. The Justice Department's acknowledgement of institutional failures and the federal legislation requiring serious missing persons investigation named for Margaret's sister Dorothy. The impossible questions about whether killing 18 people could ever be justified when responding to murders that authorities refused to investigate, and whether victims whose degrees of culpability varied should have been distinguished rather than being targeted equally. Leave your like and share. Subscribe for stories examining how institutional biases minimizing violence against women create desperate responses, how law enforcement dismissals of missing persons cases enable criminal enterprises to continue killing vulnerable people, how systematic violence affects everyone when official negligence allows predatory schemes to operate for years, killing multiple victims whose families' persistent complaints are systematically ignored. Comment about whether Margaret's campaign was proportional response to murders and to institutional failures, or whether alternatives existed that proper advocacy through media or civil rights organizations might have achieved, whether 52 years and federal legislation provide adequate resolution when violence killed 18, including coerced participants whose families suffered losses, whether memorial should emphasize murdered women or acknowledge complexity, including perpetrators' varied culpability. Because these questions persist wherever criminal enterprises exploit vulnerable people, wherever law enforcement minimizes violence against women through dismissing complaints based on unjustified assumptions about voluntary absence, wherever families must decide between accepting that institutional channels won't provide protection or justice and employing desperate measures that legal systems condemn, but that official negligence sometimes provokes when alternatives are systematically denied, and when authorities demonstrate unwillingness to take seriously violence affecting populations that societal biases characterize as undeserving of investigative resources or protection that more privileged groups receive.